Here's an example case study. We took a couple of students who were completely disengaged during computing, and we did this because often, especially students with disabilities, weren't given the opportunity to try to learn how to program because their teachers didn't think that they were able to do so. So we picked students who were completely disengaged, had fairly significant disabilities. We observed them, we interviewed their special ed teachers, their general education teachers, the support staff, and we essentially asked, what were the computational thinking specific supports that were needed for these students with disabilities so that they could engage in computational thinking instruction and activities? So these are a couple of students. These are not their real names. Horatio was a 4th grade student at the time. He had autism and an intellectual disability and very limited social skills. This is a young man who spent the majority of his day in the general education setting with his peers, but he had a one-on-one adult support person with him the entire time. He liked playing repetitive games on the computer, and he enjoyed interactions with his peers, but he didn't actually invite his peers to interact with him. So for example, he liked his peers chasing him on the playground, and his peers knew that, but he never initiated that himself. The other student, Deacon, was a 5th grade student. He had a fetal alcohol syndrome, and because of that had a lot of attention issues, a lot of behavior issues, and learning disability that affected his academic abilities. He also spent the majority of his day in the general education classroom. This is a kid who loved Minecraft. This is a child who loved being on the computer, hated computing. Like, couldn't stand it. And he also enjoyed hanging out with a couple of his peers. So initially, Horatio was completely disengaged during computing instruction. He either didn't know what to do, and every time he didn't know what to do, his support staff would take his computer and try to solve the computational task and talk to Horatio. And while that was happening, he was looking around the room and he just wasn't engaged. And there were some times where the computer was in front of him, but he was disengaged as well. But the majority of the time, about 75% of the time, it just wasn't working for him. The only intervention that we did for Horatio is we told his support staff to keep the computer in front of him and to just talk to him and use some verbal prompting. And so as soon as that happened, Horatio was able to engage with the computing. He just needed a little bit of extra verbal prompting. When he got stuck, he needed somebody to tell him, why don't you try to do this? And as soon as he got unstuck, he was able to continue on. And so this was an incredible finding because initially our research question was, what were the computationally specific strategies that we would need to do for him in order to help him be successful? And what we found is a very simple intervention that was actually working across all the other content areas, because for Horatio, he also needed verbal prompting during English class, during social studies, during math. When he was stuck, somebody needed to give him the next step so he can move forward. The same thing was actually true with Deacon as well. So when we first observed Deacon, and this is such a smart kid, he had 2 tabs open. One tab was open to the computing task that he was supposed to do, and the other tab was open to Minecraft. And every time the teacher was around, he had the computing task open, but he wasn't engaged. He just wasn't doing it. And as soon as she walked away, he was working on Minecraft. And so the only thing that we then did for Deacon is the kind of behavior supports that worked in his other content areas, we implemented in computing. We provided a reward chart for him to be able to continue to do his computing task. As soon as we did that, all of a sudden he got engaged. And the thing about Deacon is that once he got engaged, his creativity took over. So the same kind of creativity that he enjoyed in Minecraft, he was able to find in the computing task. But because he had that reward system in place for himself, he had that initial prompt to get started. And then once he started, he just took off with it and was able to do a lot more than anybody expected. And actually, that's true for both of these students. Their teachers were shocked at what they were able to do because initially, remember, they thought these students' disabilities prevented them from being able to actually be engaged and learn computing. And it was the very simple approaches that worked in the other content areas that worked within this content as well. Now, that doesn't mean that there are some students that aren't going to need much more pervasive supports in computing. What it means is that for most of the students with disabilities that we think can't do it because we're not providing the appropriate supports, they actually can if we take what we know from other content and apply it within computing. What we're doing now is we're taking what we've learned and we're scaling. So we're working in New York City public schools, and we're looking across different platforms such as Codable and Bootstrap and Code.org, and we're looking at how kids at risk for academic failure and kids with disabilities are collaborating together. What kind of instructional strategies help them? So we're able to look at what we've learned at the small scale and see whether it transfers at the large scale. We also have an NSF project that looks at integrating computing into math instruction. So we're teaching applied mathematics through computing. We're continuing to look at individual and content-specific supports. So even though what we saw for Horatio and Deacon were that the supports they needed were very general, we're also going, are there some content-specific computer science supports that we can layer on top of it? And we're continuing to look at collaborative computing and the kind of strategies we can help with that.